We have a food system that is extremely effective at producing nutrition-free calories that are cheap at the point of sale and devastatingly expensive in terms of public health.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada-Gore. This is episode 81, and my guest is Pam Hess of Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Its mission is to create a more equitable and sustainable local food system. Pam is a former national security journalist who came to the field of food and farming by an unconventional route, but she is passionate and well-informed, ready to educate us about why our system is so broken. She goes over the history of where we've been as a nation and where we are today. You are going to be riveted by all she brings to the table. Before we get into the conversation, we want to thank our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Chelsea Green Publishing, now an employee-owned company. The Politics and Practice of Sustainable Living. Learn more at chelseagreen.com. Hey, and the Wise Traditions Conference is coming up. This year will be in Minneapolis, Minnesota, November 10th to the 13th. Hear speakers like those featured on these podcasts. We are taking our health to new heights, so go to wisetraditions.org for details. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Pam.
Thank you so much.
I was blown away when I read that you were a journalist that covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you've just been all over the world in the heat of these, hot spots. How is it that now you're in this whole food movement? It's so drastically different. Tell us that story.
Yeah, my life is just sort of a series of accidents. When I got out of college, I started teaching in a civics program called Close Up. It's a foundation, nonpartisan, and I really loved the process of teaching because I found that I learned so much more when I had to teach it the next morning to a room or a bus full of sleepy high school students. And when I wound down on that job, making $11,000 a year, I decided that the thing that I really loved was that process of taking vast quantities of information and making it interesting and relevant. And so that, of course, led me to journalism. And then the job that I happened to get was working on an industry newsletter. So sort of almost industrial espionage covering the Pentagon. It's not quite industrial espionage, but I'd wander around the Pentagon and make friends with people and grab, memos off their desk with their permission. And so it was reporting on the money. I was following the money on the weapons systems and the testing that was coming out. And in the course of that, the Kosovo War broke out, and I was hired by United Press International to cover the Pentagon at large. So I moved out of the newsletter world into, sort of a wire service. And then 9/11 happened, and Iraq and Afghanistan, other way actually, and I just happened to get sent over. So that was purely accidental, although it turns out it was really a dream come true. I was very moved by Christiane Amanpour during the Bosnia War and what she was able to do, and so I was glad to get to do something approaching that. So after I finished with UPI, I was hired by the Associated Press, and I was covering intel, and it was a really grueling job covering the CIA. And these are in the, height of torture. If you want to know, like the 9 things you're not allowed to do to people during interrogations, I can tell you. So it just got to be a real grind after 3 years of being woken up, 4 nights a week to be told that there was some bomb that exploded somewhere, and it was my job to figure out what and where. I got hired onto Capitol Hill, which I took as a sort of a way out. And then I got fired after a few months there. And I had started freelancing for a little food magazine for free. And it turns out that they needed an editor. So I got back into journalism, and I became the editor of this little local food magazine that covered sustainable farmers and the businesses who supported them and telling their stories. And so in the course of that, Arcadia got organized and we did a story on Arcadia. And I met and just loved the founder and his vision, Michael Babin. And so we stayed in touch for 2 years. And then he asked me to come run Arcadia. So it's just a pure accident. There's zero amount of logic, and it's an absolutely probably unrepeatable path. There's a lot of people who I'm very, honored and flattered that want to do the kind of work that I get to do with Arcadia. And, these young people with very excitable, and they want to know, how do you do it? And I was like, well, first become a journalist, go to war, get fired a few times, start a little magazine, and then there you are. So it's an unrepeatable path. But it gets me back to what I loved when I was little. I was obsessed with food from the time I was born. My mom was really focused on seasonal eating, and we had a garden and we foraged for blackberries and we picked apples. And so this really takes me back to that. I supported myself in college by cooking professionally in Washington, D.C. And then in 2006, I read The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is sort of the entry drug for most people in the sustainable food movement, as it was for me. And it all just kind of came together. I think that the one thing that I try to tell people who are younger than me that are sort of figuring their way out is don't try to plot your path. Just do the next interesting thing that is offered to you. Because if you try to plot it, you'll block out too many other opportunities. You can only see one path ahead of you and you miss everything else. So I have succeeded by accident.
A very unconventional path that's taken you to just the right place. Now, listen, you're a reporter, so you've got that background, so you know how to dig deep to get the real story. Like, what is going on with our food? What is making it such a broken system, do you think, Pam?
Oh my gosh, it is something that I dig into from a professional perspective, and also just I'm personally interested in it. And the Omnivore's Dilemma is really helpful in helping me identify that interest in myself. So the real thing here is, and I don't mean to sound like, a crazy hippie, but it's capitalism is the problem. And there have been a number of historical accidents that came together. So for most of humanity, we've eaten the same kind of food. We've eaten what we grow or what our neighbors grow or what we're able to hunt. And that was basically the case up until, the 19th century. And then you come into the 20th century and there's a few things that happen right away. And one of them is the invention of cars. So now people have a way of carrying a lot of stuff, and they have a way of living farther from their neighbors and farther from their neighborhood stores. Mm-hmm. You have the invention of the shopping cart at a Piggly Wiggly in like 1910. And that shopping cart meant that now you can go to the store and you can really load up on stuff instead of just buying enough food for 1 or 2 days. So now you're stocking up, right? Then you have World War II comes along. Well, World War I comes along, and there's a lot of changes between the wars with the Depression and the drought that was caused by, frankly, not the drought wasn't caused by unsustainable agriculture, but the Dust Bowls were, it was unsustainable agricultural practices. And then you have World War II happens. And a couple things happen here. Number one, the scientific advancements that were associated with the development of nuclear weapons produced a lot of knowledge and a whole industry that after the war and after the bombs were done being made needed to do something. And these are the DuPonts and the Dow chemicals that were producing armaments. And now they're using what they learned about nitrogen and phosphorus to make bombs instead to make fertilizer. You have, after the Cold War, you really didn't know what you were getting into here. After the Cold War,
this is great. I'm getting a little history lesson. I love it. Continue.
You have the creation of the interstate highway system. And this was something that was put together, I think, by Eisenhower or Truman. I'm not sure which one. I think Eisenhower. They were very concerned that there was going to be a war with the Soviet Union, now Russia, and they needed a way to rapidly get troops deployed. So they created this interstate system. You have the explosion of the suburbs when after World War II, when GIs are coming back and everybody now has a car that they can fill with those groceries from their big cart, and they all have refrigerators at home. And so there's this separation that's going on. So you have the explosion of fertilizer, the means of transportation. You have people buying more and more food and living farther and farther from their neighbors and from their grocery stores. And so all of that is kind of setting the stage for big food to come in. So Then you have farms that are now back at the turn of the century, we had an industrial revolution, and there was this whole change in the way that we thought about the production of everything. Mm-hmm. And there was, cars created this factory mindset, and people said, this is so efficient. Let's figure out how we can apply this to the production of food so we can have more efficient production of food. And so you have these farms getting ever larger and more mechanized, and they're producing lots of food.
So I'm hearing this progression. Tell me about what was happening on the political scene.
So lots of things were happening politically. Probably the most important and the one that touches everyone in a way that we are now seeing the health effects of is during the Nixon administration, the USDA and the Economic Research Service looked ahead and prophesied that the Soviet Union was going to have a drought and their grain crop was going to fail. And so Nixon, remember, we were in an ideological battle with the Soviet Union then. Was it going to be capitalism or communism? Which was a better system? Mm-hmm. So Nixon was like, we are going to strike a blow for capitalism. And he told all of the farmers, plant corn because the Soviet Union is going to need our corn. We're going to have it. We're going to avert a famine in the Soviet Union. We're going to sell corn. We're going to prove that capitalism is the best system. And so the farmers started planting this corn. And the way that the government made sure that that happened was by offering them a flat price for it. Plant corn. We don't care how much you grow. You're going to get $2.50 a bushel or whatever the amount was. Mm-hmm. So the farmers planted the corn. And the government bought it. Turns out the Soviet Union did not experience a famine. They did not buy the corn, so the corn had to go into silos. And this happened for a couple of years. And now you have farmers who are planting corn and expecting to get a set price for it. These are the price supports that you hear about, or the crop subsidies that you hear about.
Okay, so there's all this corn kind of piling up on all these farms. What to do with it, right?
Right. So Big Food steps in and says, this is cheap food. The government paid for it already. Let's figure out how we can put all of this feed corn to use. Now, this is not the sweet corn that you get at your farm stand. This is feed corn. This is number 2 corn that animals eat, and that gets turned into things like high fructose corn syrup and turns into animal feed for cows. Now, cows are herbivores. They like grass, and that's what they eat. And we started feeding them corn. And what we found was that the cows got really fat and really delicious and really fast on high calorie corn versus all that grass they used to eat. So now we have this massive explosion in corn-fed, delicious Ruth Chris steakhouse beef, and everybody loves it. In American beef, it's what's for dinner. And you have high fructose corn syrup, and you have corn chips, and you have all of these different derivations of this corn that we wouldn't eat on our plate.
I've read The Omnivore's Dilemma as well, and this is the most eye-opening part of it for me, where he talks about how so much of what is on the American plate now is derived from corn.
Right. Something like 80% of the food that we eat is somehow related to corn. And in many cases, it's because that's what the animals ate, and it's not their natural food. We are now feeding corn to salmon on salmon farms. I promise you that in the vast history of the world, salmon have never eaten corn until we fed it to them.
So just think about this for a minute too, Pam. If the cows were getting very fat on this diet that wasn't naturally theirs, just imagine what's happening to the people, right?
Right. We eat what the food that we eat eats. It's sort of a complicated statement, but there you have it. If you're going to eat meat, which I do, you want to eat meat that is raised in a way that is natural and healthy for that animal. Because if that animal is healthy and natural, then so it goes, you shall be if you eat them. Mm-hmm. We are not just what we eat, but what we digest and what we sort of take into our skin, a rather esoteric thought. But so you have this whole explosion in corn products. And not incidentally, if you track the rise of diabetes and heart disease and obesity, what you'll find is that right about 1980, it starts to go up. And then in 1990, it increases precipitously. And we're now to the point where I think at least a third of us are obese or overweight. And there are places in this city in Washington, D.C., where the 77% of the population is overweight. And if you lay down a map of where that obesity and diabetes exists in Washington, it is over low-income neighborhoods where there is not a grocery store.
Coming up, Pam explains the impact of big food and geopolitics on our current food system. We want to pause now and thank our sponsors. Chelsea Green Publishing is recognized as a leading publisher of books about organic farming and gardening, homesteading, local food, restorative living, and diet-focused integrative health. Some recent and best-selling health titles include Human Heart, Cosmic Heart by Dr. Tom Cowan, The Alzheimer's Antidote by Amy Berger, and The Metabolic Approach to Cancer by Dr. Nasha Winters and Jess Higgins Kelly. Learn more about these titles and other books at chelseagreen.com. Are you enjoying these podcasts? You can hear speakers like those featured here in person at the Wise Traditions Conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota this November. You will have opportunities to connect with them personally, delve deeper, ask questions, and connect with other like-minded people who care about nourishing their health through nutrient-dense foods. Don't miss the chance to meet Sally Fallon-Morell, Dr. Tom Cowan, Ben Greenfield, and more. The presentations are just part of the charm of the conference. There are amazing meals, tons of exhibitors, and over 1,000 attendees. I'll be there too, so come join us. Go to wisetraditions.org for details.
There's one other current that's important and that expresses itself in Washington and probably in other cities. And this is the city that I live in and I love and I study. So there's something else that happened. When we were talking about how people were moving to the suburbs in the 60s, Washington, all the way up to about the 60s, Washington, D.C. had a pretty vibrant network of neighborhood independently owned stores. After Martin Luther King was assassinated and the riots happened, a lot of the middle class, white and black, fled the city. And what that did was drain the resources out of the neighborhoods that supported these stores where people could buy a healthy diet. So if you were poor or you were wealthy, if you lived in the neighborhood, you had a store that was good and you could eat. Now, all of the wealth, so much of the wealth left, I think still 70% of Washington, D.C. buys their food outside of the city. So they're going to suburban grocery stores. Now, suburban grocery stores exist for a reason. One, that's where all the people with the big houses and the big fridges and the big cars are. But two, if you're going to build a new grocery store, you need a big plot of land because you need people to be spending $300 or $400 every time they come in, because grocery stores have really, really slim margins. You know, they're making 1 or 2%. So they need people to come in and spend. So that means you need to have a parking lot so that people can spend. And it also means you need to have a lot of square footage so you can have all of these products on your shelf. Because if you offer one kind of potato chip, then people will only buy one bag of potato chip. But if you have potato chips and tortilla chips and Cool Ranch and nacho cheese, and then you have like those weird cappuccino potato chips, now people are maybe buying 2 or 3 bags of snacks. So the more that you offer, the more that people will buy. So that's the economics of a grocery store.
I love that you're describing this scenario because you've basically gone through the history of how we got where we are today. And I have the feeling we're on the brink of talking about some solutions. But when you talk about these suburban grocery stores, I can just picture them in my mind. There's no way we can replicate that in the city, right?
Right, because you need vast quantities of land. And in the city, it's really hard to find vast quantities of land because people own different plots that are, you know, maybe 30 feet wide. So you're dealing with, if you're trying to get, you know, a few hundred feet on a street, you have to deal with how many different landowners, and each one of them knows that you're negotiating with the other. And it's a really difficult problem. And then you also need room to park the cars. Otherwise, people can't buy enough stuff that make it worth your while to have that store. So what's happened in DC particularly, and it happens in other cities as well, is that where most people are getting, especially low-income people, where they're getting their food is corner stores. And the corner stores don't typically carry a diet that can support a healthy life. They might have a few bananas and apples or a couple of onions and a head of cabbage and say that they're healthy, but generally you can't buy a regular healthy diet there. And there's a reason why. So these corner stores, they make money by selling stuff that is shelf stable. And so that's Pop-Tarts that last forever. You buy a Pop-Tart year 1, you can still sell it year 2, and you're not going to notice a difference in freshness. They're selling soda and cigarettes and liquor and lottery tickets. And these things don't require any special care. If we want these corner stores to be able to support a healthy diet, they need a place where they can have greens that are on ice so that the greens stay fresh, and they need a place where the apples can be separate from the potatoes because the ethylene coming off ripening apples will turn the potatoes bad. So there's a lot of skill that goes in with greengrocing, with with maintaining good quality food that your customers can come in and buy. And frankly, people who own corner stores are not necessarily interested in doing that. It's a totally different business model. And there's 30% wastage in that model because you're constantly cutting off leaves of cabbage that are turning brown, or, lettuce that is wilting, you're tossing it out. Food that gets picked over, people don't want to buy. You have to have a real commitment to green grossing, and you have to be making enough money. And that demand for that food has to be evinced to you to convince you that you're going to make money by doing this thing that is frankly a pain in your ass. So you talked about solutions.
Yes.
Do you feel like you understand sort of how we've gotten where we've gotten? And let me say the following. I talk about this a lot, and it's really important to know. I was, as you noted, a war reporter. I covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I visited a lot of people who were injured in those wars because, you're downrange and somebody says, hey, go see my buddy when you get back to Washington. He's at Bethesda Naval. He lost a leg. So I go and visit people and, pass along greetings and bring cookies or whatever. And so that was my frame of reference. When I started working with Arcadia, which I guess we're going to talk about now, and the work that we do in food security and food access, I was rolling around on our mobile market just to sort of understand what we do. And I saw a lot of people who were missing limbs, lower limbs. And to me, that's a veteran, right? This is somebody who was hit by an improvised explosive device or a landmine and lost a leg. And so I said that. I was like, wow, there's a lot of veterans here. And my staff looked at me like I was insane. And they said, these aren't veterans. This is diabetes. Mm-hmm. So I looked it up. And in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, about, 15 years of war, there have been about 2,000 amputations in the United States. In 1 year alone, we have about 70,000 diabetic amputations.
You're kidding
because we
me.
cannot be bothered to provide people with affordable, desirable, quality, healthy food.
Those numbers are staggering, and it's a shame. So now, when you started with Arcadia, did you know anything about agriculture? How were you hoping to tackle this problem?
No, I knew very little about agriculture, only what I'd read basically in The Omnivore's Dilemma, and then what I'd sort of picked up reading. But I quickly learned, because I was a reporter, and I learned continuously. And one of the things that I learned is we were applying for something called a specialty crop grant. And this is important for people to understand. So the USDA gives out these grants to organizations who are doing stuff. And so we were applying for a specialty crop grant. And I said to my colleague, Matt, who handles our grant writing, I was like, ooh, what are we growing? Like shiitake mushrooms? That's a specialty. And he, again, looked at me like I was insane and said, no, specialty crops are fruits and vegetables. And I said, how is that a specialty? And he said, crops are corn, wheat, soy, cotton, that sort of thing. Specialty crops are the fruits and vegetables that wind up on our plate. That is the stuff that we know as food. 95% of all of the crops grown in the United States are those commodity crops: corn, wheat, soy, cotton. 5% is the food that we eat.
What? That is blowing my mind.
It blew my mind. It makes absolutely no sense. And so one of the things that the founder of Arcadia, Michael Babin, said once that I thought was just genius is that we have a food system that is extremely effective at producing nutrition-free calories that are cheap at the point of sale and devastatingly expensive in terms of public health. We spend $500 billion at least every year treating chronic diseases, which are diseases of lifestyle. They are caused by the food that we eat and by some lifestyle choices, smoking and exercise, but mostly it's the food that we eat. Diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, half of all cancers, obesity. These are all intimately related to the food that we eat. Now, I have no excuse. I'm overweight and it's hard to eat well. And I have a college degree and I own my house and I run an organization that has 2 farms and 14 farmers markets to it. I have no excuse. However, when I'm in the neighborhoods that we serve with the mobile market, these folks cannot make a bad choice because they do not have a choice to begin with. They're eating what is there. And if they are going to get a healthy diet, it is going to involve an effort and time where they're taking 2 or 3 buses to get to a grocery store that can support a healthy diet and carrying back what they can carry because they don't have cars and they have to take public transportation to a grocery store and there's not a grocery store in their neighborhood. And so they can only carry what they can carry back and then they have to repeat the whole process. And I deal with a lot of people who are like, well, that's their own fault, blah, 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 blah. But it's really not. As Americans, we have a reflexive belief that the free market works. It will solve our problems. And that means we think that, hey, if the demand, say, for healthy food is there, then a store will be there to meet it. But I'm here to tell you that those economics do not work when it comes to low-income neighborhoods and low-income people and healthy food. There's a mismatch there. It is not that demand doesn't exist. It's that the customers that we serve at Arcadia simply don't have enough money to get the attention of the people who control the healthy food. There's even a little thing I can share with you. Most farmers markets in DC, we have really wonderful farmers markets here with great farmers who I love, and many of them are my friends, but they won't show up at a market unless they know they're going to make about $1,000 to $1,500 an outing. And there's a reason why. These farmers are working 7 days a week as it is. They're taking a day out of their schedule. They're harvesting. They're bringing all of this food to market. It's sitting out in the sun. They cannot sell it at the end of that day if it hasn't been sold. So their calculation is it's only worth it to me to do that if I can sell $1,000 at the farmer's market. So that means that they are choosing to go to markets, for the most part, in neighborhoods where you have a lot of wealthier people who are going to come and spend $50 or $100 on the food that they're buying and taking home, and they'll probably toss out half of it because they won't get to it. You know, I'm guilty of the same thing. So the free market simply, the numbers just don't work. And at Arcadia, we can prove that there is demand for healthy food and in low-income neighborhoods and that have not been served by the retail food economy.
So you have painted a rather bleak picture of our broken food system, which has me on the edge of my seat. And so what we're going to have to do, Pam, is do a part 2 so that we can find out more about, yes, we see where it's broken. How can we fix it? How can we all be part of the solution? Because my listeners are motivated people who understand that food can be our medicine and medicine should be our food. And so we want to really make that available to other people. So will you come back on the show again? Can we do a part 2?
Yes, please.
So before we do our part 2, I want to wrap up this episode by asking you, if the listener could only do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
Cut out processed food, cook for yourself, and also drink water.
Also,
Don't drink soda.
Drink water. Okay, got it. Thank you so much, Pam.
Thanks.
My guest today was Pam Hess of Arcadia Center for Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Learn more about all of the amazing things Arcadia is doing at arcadiafood.org. And go to our website, westinaprice.org, for highlights from today's episode. Click on the podcast page and look for the show notes for episode 81. And thanks to Olivia Stanforth for help with show notes and to Sarah Fernandez of Podcast Village for editing assistance. You guys are the best. Hey, and don't forget to look me up, everyone. I'm Holistic Hilda on Facebook, holistichilda.com, at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, and at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram. Talk to you soon.
Have you been enjoying these podcasts? Have you benefited from them or from the resources on the website or local chapter meetings? If so, please become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's only $25 for students and seniors and $40 for a general membership. Your contribution is critical for the continued work of the foundation. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.